Hello, and welcome to the Snowbrains podcast. I'm your host, Miles Clark. This podcast is going to be a little different. The USA just went through its deadliest avalanche cycle in history, with 16 avalanche fatalities in only 10 days, from January 30th, 2021 to February 8th, 2021. I think it's really affected all of us in our community. My guest today is Dr. Ethan Greene, the director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, who's here to talk us through just what's happening in the Colorado snowpack right now and why we're seeing so many multi-victim avalanches in the USA and why we've just seen this huge cluster of avalanche fatalities in the USA in only 10 days. Sadly, since Dr. Ethan Greene and I recorded this podcast on February 11th, 2021, 9 more people have died in avalanches in the USA, bringing the total to 25 avalanche deaths in only 22 days in the USA. By far, the deadliest avalanche cycle in U.S. recreational history. 3 of the latest avalanche deaths occurred on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2021. 2 of the Valentine's Day avalanche fatalities were in Colorado. Then there was 1 avalanche death per day for 4 days, right up until February 20th, when there were 2 avalanche deaths. There was 1 avalanche death on each of these days. February 16th, February 17th, February 18th, February 19th, and then 2 avalanche deaths on February 20th, bringing the total to 25 avalanche deaths in only 22 days. We've now lost 31 lives to avalanches in the USA in the 2020-2021 winter season, and it's only February 22nd. The USA averages 27 avalanche fatalities per season. Hello, Ethan. Welcome back to the show, and thank you so much for being here. How are you?
Hi, Miles. Thanks for the invitation. I'm doing okay, I guess, all things considered. It's been a bit of a whirlwind.
I agreed. And I think that this has really affected all of us in so many ways. And I'm so sorry we're not here on better circumstances, but we need to talk about what just happened in the USA. An unprecedented 16 avalanche fatalities in only 10 days from January 30th, 2021 to February 8th, 2021. This is something that's never happened before. 111 years ago, in 1910, there was a large amount of avalanche deaths in only one day due to a train getting hit by an avalanche in Washington state. But that's an entirely different story. Those people didn't choose to be in avalanche terrain, whereas the 16 people who perished in the USA in only 10 days this month, they did choose to be in avalanche terrain. That's a big difference. And that's why this 10-day stretch was unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before in the USA. And that's why we're having this conversation today. It's remarkable that 5 of those 16 deaths happened in Utah were via only 2 events. And then 4 more of the 16 fatalities happened in Colorado were also via only 2 events. So, my question just to start is, Ethan, what happened out there? What factors came together to cause this terrible 10-day stretch in the USA?
Well, frankly, I don't know, because we're sort of in the middle of it at this point. We're having an unusual year in Colorado, and that's played into a lot of accidents, a lot of involvements of people getting caught in avalanches. We had 4 people killed in a month in December, and then 4 people killed in, a week or less than a week in February. I think Utah is dealing with a similar animal out there in that they have an exceptionally weak snowpack, but it also sounds like they're dealing with, more kind of hard slab, deep slab instabilities in some ways. And then as you move to other parts of the country, I think what's happening up in the Pacific Northwest, although I don't know for sure, is pretty different in that they're actually having a lot of snowfall and some really big avalanches just from big precipitation events. There have been people that have looked a little bit at clusters of accidents in the past, especially as big snowstorms move through the United States. You tend to see avalanche danger rise on the West Coast and then move inland. And certainly avalanche accidents can kind of follow those weather patterns because of some of the underlying conditions that we're seeing in Utah and Colorado specifically. I think that's amplified things a little bit, to produce this cluster, which, like you said, is is unprecedented in the period of time when avalanche accidents have been driven by recreation. But there's a lot of devils in the details. And, I think people are going to be kind of sorting that out a little bit now, but over the next few months. One of the things that you did talk about that I think is a really important point is the multiple fatality incidents, both in Utah and Colorado. And then some of the other incidents that have happened where only one person has died, there's been multiple people caught in those avalanches. And that's a really scary thing. And I think that's something that we all need to really pay attention to. Those basic tenets of just exposing one person at a time to the avalanche risk, thinking really carefully about the concept of a safety spot and what is actually safe and what is just a normal place to stop or collect, which I think has been an issue in some of the accidents we've seen over the last week. Certainly for what we're seeing in Colorado, a lot of what we're telling people is that this is not an unprecedented year in terms of the weakness of the snowpack, but it is an unusual year. We've put it at about 1 in 10. And so the places that you're used to collecting, the routes you're used to taking, you really need to take another look at those this year and decide whether they work for the current conditions, because some of these accidents are directly due to people doing things that they feel like are normal, but are not appropriate for just the unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual conditions we see.
Well, that's great advice. It sounds like essentially what you're saying is we really need to look at the fundamentals and really go back to the basics and maybe even take it a step more conservative than we normally do when we're out there, especially in familiar terrain. I know I'm guilty of that. I get in familiar terrain and I just kind of lock into habits and I'm not adjusting as I should for the latest, most current conditions. And so that's great advice. So let's all think about the fundamentals and be really strict on that. The armchair quarterbacks online on the chairlift, people that I see in the backcountry are all pointing to two factors they think are contributing to this cluster of avalanche accidents. And they are generally saying, coronavirus has more people out in the backcountry potentially this year than normal for various reasons. And that we had that dry spell in December in a lot of the Intermountain West, and including, California and the West Coast, and that created a weaker snowpack. Can you speak to those two factors and tell us what you think there?
Sure. Well, again, I got to be careful about speaking about too many areas outside of Colorado because, especially on a busy year like this, it's just really hard to pay attention to everything that's happening around the country, especially when, my area of responsibility is really Colorado, which is a big enough area that can be a little hard to keep a handle on, by itself, which is why I have a great staff that does all that work. That usually just tells me what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's just focus on Colorado on those two questions, on those 2 points.
The basal weak layers that we have, and I think that's probably what you're talking about in other places, that's definitely played a role in what's happening in Colorado. And that's why I talk about, and the center itself has been, trying to discuss just that this is not unusual or not unprecedented for us. We get depth hoar layers, weak faceted layers. I mean, that is Colorado in a nutshell.
Right.
But just how weak this is and how that's playing into the character of the avalanche activity, that's something that, again, is not unprecedented, but is not something that we see on a given year. The last year we saw something quite as fragile as this was the 2011-2012 winter. In that winter, we had pretty dry conditions until the middle of January. And then we had 3 fatal accidents in 24 hours when we had a big storm system, move in. So this year has played out a little bit differently. We started seeing that loading on that really fragile structure in kind of mid-December and, immediately saw just widespread human activity. We had 2 weeks in a row where we recorded more human-triggered avalanches than any other 7-day period than we had in the last 10 years.
Really? Wow.
That led into, 4 avalanche fatalities. There's a handful of months at that point. There was 9 months in kind of the modern avalanche era database where 4 people had been killed in avalanches, and only 6 months in that period, that's 1950 on, wow, where there was more than 4 people killed. So it was the worst December than we had since 2008. Then things quieted down for us. We still had some pretty sensitive avalanche conditions, but it didn't lead to nearly as many accidents in January. And then this, heavy snowfall that started, especially in the southern mountains around the 22nd of January, that led into this horrible week in February. So we had 4 people killed in February in the first 6 days. So for us, that puts us at 8 deaths in the state so far this year. Our average over 10 years is 6. So
Wow.
being at 8 in the beginning of February is a bad place to be. That is not a good scenario for us. And we're really trying to reach out to people to talk about the character of these avalanches. Those weak layers that you've mentioned are the underlying culprit, but just looking at how these avalanches break, I think, especially for people that are spending a lot of time thinking about avalanches or being in avalanche terrain, we're seeing a lot of remote triggers. So much so that we put out, a video just about remote triggers, around New Year's.
And tell us what a remote trigger is real quick, please.
So a remote trigger is where you can trigger an avalanche when you're not on the steep terrain, when you're not in the start zone. So from an adjacent slope, you start a crack that runs to a steep area of terrain and produces an avalanche, or from below the slope. And so, we're seeing people talk about, one thing and shooting cracks. So we're seeing people get shooting cracks that run 1,000 feet through the snow and trigger an avalanche.
Wow.
And so that's the other point that we've been trying to really get across to people is just the wide propagation of these slabs. So, we talk a lot about persistent slab avalanches and how things tend to break across terrain features. So, you go to a bowl that has a subridge in it and you're triggering a storm slab avalanche and it pops out, something that's maybe a couple hundred feet wide and is contained by, the subridges and islands of trees and what other terrain features you have there. Persistent slab avalanches tend to break across some of those things. So, maybe it goes through that tree island and releases the slope on both sides of it or something like that. What we're seeing is kind of an extreme version of that where these fractures can propagate through multiple terrain features. So on a ridge line that's fluted, that has a bunch of open slopes separated by subridges, someone walks up to the top and triggers a piece of the cornice that pops out a slab and it zippers across these open slopes around the subbridges through the tree islands and, releases something that's, 800 feet wide. That's something that we're not seeing in isolation. It's something that we are seeing a lot. And so getting those concepts across to people that you can trigger avalanches from low angle terrain and those fractures can run really far and release really wide avalanches. In Colorado, because where you have a lower than average snowpack, those avalanches, especially in December, they weren't huge avalanches. But of course, it's February now. We've had a lot more snowfall and they have gotten a lot bigger.
And I do want to interject here and just make it clear to our listeners that in my mind, at least, a remote triggered avalanche is the most terrifying because you're skiing a mellow bowl and you could trigger an avalanche. And it sounds like what you're talking about right now is that it could be in the next bowl over and maybe even 2 bowls over from you. You could be triggering avalanches from where you are. So the consequences of your actions in the backcountry, suddenly become exponentially larger than they were any other time. And if that's as widespread in Colorado, that is the most scary scenario. Somebody could trigger an avalanche where you are from a bowl or 2 away. And that's a really scary situation.
We haven't seen quite as much interaction of groups. Not to say that that's not happening, but we definitely have seen where people have gone out into the backcountry and come back and sent us in observations where they, hiked up a certain area and then decided to ski down a low angle slope and saw an avalanche that they then, because of information that they collected or got from another group in the area, they realized that they had triggered on the hike up or something like that. So it really is just a broader need for situational awareness, really thinking about, for your own personal safety, what terrain are you connected to, what you're walking on, where you're going, what are the connected slopes, and could any of those pose a threat to your route?
And so is that remote triggering in this week, these weak layers in the snow, these scary layers in the snow, is that still happening now? And is there any sign that might improve in the future?
It is still happening now. And Improve is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. The problem that we have is that as the slab on top of those layers starts to get thicker, it becomes harder to impact that layer. But when you do impact it, you can elicit this type of response. So what it means is that we start to see a decrease in remotely triggered avalanches, not because the potential is not there, but because it becomes harder to find that spot. But when you do, you still get that avalanche, and it's much larger. We are also seeing mid-pack weak layers that have formed, like some of the accidents, like the accident down by Ophir Pass in the first week of February. So that started on a weak layer, just a near surface faceted layer, that was on the snow surface before the storm. And then we put, I think, about 3 inches of water weight on top of that. And so the avalanche started on that layer, but then stepped down to the basal facets that formed, in October. So, we have, in some places, a lot of places now, really, we have multiple weak layers, and the interaction between those is quite dangerous.
And so for our listeners, the basal facets are these really loose grains of snow, the really weak layer. So the worst case scenario, essentially. So where those are is where a weak layer is where a problem happens. And to take one step backwards too, there is this remote triggering possibility, and it's getting buried, right? As we keep getting more and more and more snow. So there's some bridging there, right? So when you step on the snow, maybe there's enough snow on top to kind of bridge, keep yourself away from that triggering that layer. But what happens is you end up in a lower probability, higher consequence scenario, I believe is also what he's saying. So it's low likelihood that you're going to trigger that in some places, but if it goes, it's going to be catastrophic. You're talking, how deep could these avalanches be, Ethan?
Well, we still have generally a shallow snowpack. So, a lot of these avalanches are, kind of 2 to 3 feet deep. But when they're breaking into bigger wind pillows, we're getting stuff that's, more 5 to 7 feet deep. So they're not the biggest avalanches that you see around here. But as far as being, a backcountry recreationalist, skier, or a snowmobiler, they are plenty big to cause you a world of hurt.
Absolutely. And I know it's difficult for you, as in our last podcast, to speak what's happening with coronavirus because there just isn't any data. But do you think it appears that more people may be using the Colorado backcountry this year? Do you think coronavirus might be impacting the amount of use, the amount of people out there, and potentially people with less experience?
It's hard to say. We've been seeing an increase in backcountry use over the last decade or so, and certainly no indication that this year is any different. We did see an increase in use over the summer, and so again, it certainly feels like there's a lot of people using the backcountry. As far as the people that have been killed in avalanches, unfortunately, they do fall into a bit of a demographic group. They're all men over 40. They're all pretty good athletes, people that are really active. Their avalanche experience is pretty varied. There's one person that was pretty new to this type of activity, even though, again, he was a pretty avid mountain athlete. And that ranges up to somebody who has, a couple of decades as a professional snow worker. But none of them are exactly what we would call newbies. They're all familiar with the mountains, recreating in the mountains, even though backcountry travel may be new to some of them. So, I think really just saying coronavirus is taking people that go to ski areas and putting them in the backcountry and they're getting into trouble. I think that is really oversimplifying what we're seeing.
That is really great information because I'm sure you've heard it too, but that's what's being said out there in lift lines and chairlifts and other places in the backcountry. And to hear that's not the case thus far is really powerful information that, I think it's easy to say, oh, it's the other people, where, a lot of times it's us. It's the people who live here and do this all the time.
I don't know if you want to cover this or not, but
go ahead.
Again, I don't want to speak too much about Utah, but from my understanding, certainly the first accident that they had in this period on, I believe the 30th on Square Top. That individual sounds like a very experienced
Yes.
backcountry traveler. And then the people that were the two groups that were involved in this accident in Mill Creek, I don't know all the details. The UAC has not finished their investigation of that, but from a little bit of the information that I've gotten, it sounds like at least some of them were pretty experienced backcountry travelers. So the narrative that this is all new people. It's not to say that that's not happening, but I think it really is oversimplifying things. And especially in Colorado, like we're really seeing people that maybe don't have the most avalanche experience, but certainly have a lot of experience moving in the mountains, enjoying backcountry sports and recreation. Really, really avid mountain athletes.
Yeah, that is just such valuable information to know that it is very likely, it doesn't look like it's just brand new people coming right out of ski resorts because of COVID and getting in avalanches. That is a really great piece of data to have and to be able to look at. We've had 3 multiple avalanche deaths happening. So we had 3 different events with, one that had 3 people in Colorado, another that had 3 people in Alaska that passed away, and another in Utah that had the 4 people pass away. And so how common are these kind of accidents that where you have more than one person that dies in an avalanche in the USA?
They definitely happen, but they are not common. And especially clusters of multiple fatalities. Spencer Logan and I did a little bit of poking around, in the database, and I don't have that stuff at my fingertips, but I think we pulled out maybe 5 or 6 events since 1950 where there were clusters of multiple fatalities that happened. So, and most of those, involved an incident with 2 people. So, having those types of events and having clusters of them are unusual.
Definitely. Yeah. It definitely woke me up, to have the 3 in Colorado, 3 in Alaska, and then 4, just the other day in Utah. I mean, when this happened, this was on the NBC nightly news. You don't see avalanches on the news, on the just regular national news. So when this makes national headlines, it's a wake-up call. And Ethan, should this be a wake-up call for all of us backcountry travelers?
Yes, I'm not sure how you would argue any other way. Seeing accidents is something that I think is really important for all of us to pay attention to. I mean, for one thing, if you are spending a lot of time in the backcountry, looking at what leads other people to get into trouble is an incredibly useful exercise, and try to understand what in your own behavior you can change, because of that. But, just going into, real simple avalanche safety. I mean, the first thing we tell people in avalanche safety courses is that the best sign of avalanche potential is seeing avalanches. And here we're seeing a bunch of avalanches that are catching people and killing people.
Absolutely. I was in Utah when that fatal 4-person avalanche happened. And man, I stayed inbounds at Park City Ski Resort and had a blast. I was terrified to even take a step out. And sometimes I think that's good, that little bit of shock and awe to get you back to where you should be. And you've mentioned where we should be, and you were really hitting the fundamentals. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit for a second is what can we do? And I think it's clear and obvious, but it's great to hear it from you. What can we do to avoid further avalanche fatalities in the USA this season?
Well, it really is sticking to the fundamentals. And, I think like those techniques, what everybody gets taught in these avalanche safety courses, like there's a reason that we teach people that stuff. They are, really good foundational pillars of how to approach avalanche safety. That's checking the avalanche forecast, making sure you get some training so you know how to apply that in the field, making sure that if you're going into avalanche terrain, that everybody in the group has proper rescue equipment, an avalanche rescue transceiver, a pro pole, and a shovel, and that everybody knows how to use that. As you start to move into people that are doing these sorts of activities all the time, again, it's really sticking to the fundamentals, like reading the avalanche forecast, thinking about where you're going, what you're going to be doing. Does your route match the conditions for the day? Are your goals consistent with the conditions for today? Just because the route that you're going to go do is something that you do all the time, like, does it make sense given what's happening right now? I think we all get a little complacent going to places that we feel comfortable, traveling in terrain that we're used to. Maybe we don't think is really that dangerous, but on a year like this, when we're seeing, remote triggers, wide propagation, maybe avalanches on lower angle slopes, they're things that we all really need to reconsider. I listened to Drew Hardesty the other day talk a little bit about this Mill Creek accident. And one of the things he talked about was that there were the groups had made multiple descents, and I don't know the details. The UAC will be coming out with that. But just talking about kind of multiple descents on that slope before it avalanched, that's a really scary thing. And that's something that people really need to pay attention to. We've seen some accidents like that here in Colorado where there's one that I remember in 2013 where we documented about over 20 descents on that slope before it pulled out an avalanche that caught two people and killed one of them. A really large avalanche. It was right before the Sheep Creek accident, actually the day before. That's something that people really need to pay attention to, because that whole idea of like, okay, we've assessed the slope, we've decided to ski it, we feel like it's safe, we're going to keep doing it. We come to a slope where people have already made descents, so that's an indication of stability. Like, you really need to rethink that approach because the types of avalanches that people are seeing don't fall into those methods.
Does this make sense given the avalanche conditions today? And I just want to repeat what you said there. That is so good. That's something I fall into all the time. I ski the same zones over and over. I think a lot of us do. And you just think, especially in the other point you made, there's already tracks. It's probably okay, but that's not the case with these hard slab avalanches, especially the Mill Creek avalanche in Utah. And to reference that for our listeners, he's referring to Mill Creek avalanche that happened in early February, and it was 4 avalanche deaths. And when he says UAC, that's the Utah Avalanche Center.
Yeah,
and so,
sorry for all the acronyms.
No, it's
one
good.
Thing I did notice, reading the products that we're putting out, reading the products that the Crested Butte Avalanche Center has been putting out, reading the products that the Utah Avalanche Center has been putting out, they're all talking about sticking to low angle slopes, 30 degrees or less.
Yes.
And so I think when you have, all of those groups putting out the same message that is not, here's where avalanches are common, but they're really saying avoid avalanche terrain, even when we're not necessarily in high danger. That just shows you how dangerous these conditions are. Like, they are, again, these are not unprecedented, but they are not common. And, if you think about the 1 in 10 year sort of weakness that we're seeing here in Colorado, that means if you've been skiing in Colorado for 20 years, this may be the second time that you've encountered conditions like this.
That is profound. And I want to reiterate that again for our listeners. If you keep it below 30 degrees in general, you're going to be okay. I mean, you still got to make sure there's nothing above you or below you, around you. But that's when I asked Mark Staples from the Utah Avalanche Center, the director there, what's the number one tool to staying out of avalanches? That's what he told me. And he pushed it hard, keep it below 30 degrees. And he also made it clear that below 30 degrees can be really fun. And I agree. It can be awesome. Hippie powder, we call it. And I think that is a really great strategy. And that's another great question for you. What do you think are the number one tools for us all to stay out of avalanches this season?
I think it really is, using the terrain to mitigate your risk. Sticking to low angle slopes, sticking to slopes that are not threatened by steeper terrain, like you're talking about. Again, Drew Hardesty at the Utah Avalanche Center wrote this the other day, and I had another friend kind of say the same thing about, not trying to outsmart the snow, not trying to weasel your way through, some complex terrain. Like, it's really a time right now to keep it simple, stick to lower angle slopes.
Kind of a terrible question, but we have to ask it because I think this is what our listeners are asking is when do you guess things will get safe again? When might this snowpack stabilize in Colorado?
I certainly can't talk about other places, but for Colorado, I mean, unfortunately, what we're telling people is not to expect it to get better. We are going to see the avalanche danger go up and go down as we see, big snowstorms and drier periods. But this character of the avalanche, that's really not going away. We've talked about a few different scenarios where things could get better, but they all have some pretty big caveats. Yes. So, I think people really need to look at the long view. There's a lot of great recreation to be done out there this year. It may not be skiing the biggest, steepest, gnarliest lines that you've been eyeing for the last couple of years. It may be that you need to shelve those for another year, but there's still lots of great stuff to be done out there. And paying attention to the forecast, like we are going to be telling you, like if things get substantially better, but you should be planning on them not getting much better for the rest of the year.
And that's great advice, because I love hearing that this is a maybe once a decade bad snowpack in Colorado. So if there was ever a year to not ski that line you've been thinking about skiing, this is the year. So that's something else that I think we should push that message. This is an exceptionally bad avalanche year. Great year to keep it mellow, ski some other stuff, look into your terrain and find that other mellower, 30 and below degree angle stuff to go have fun on. One of my last questions here is just, we've seen 22 avalanche deaths already this season, 23 avalanche deaths all of last season. This looks like it's on track. Do you think, are we on track to having one of the worst avalanche seasons ever?
Well, I don't know if we're on track to having one of the worst avalanche seasons ever. There's certainly elements of it that are unprecedented. Like you said, this week, this 10-day period, late January, early February, is unprecedented. And that certainly puts us in a bad place. I mean, for the U.S., I think the median number of avalanche fatalities at the end of February is 18, and we're at 20, 21,
22,
22,
yeah.
22 at the beginning of February. So that doesn't put us in a good place. Whether that will mean we're just above average, which again, we're talking about people's lives. So
Right.
That's a terrible thing. Being above average it has huge impacts on our community, families destroyed. I mean, it's really devastating. And I think people really need to think about the impact that this is having, both on individual families, but also communities. Certainly in Colorado, like all of these people are pillars of their community. They've been living in these mountain communities in Colorado for many, many years and are integral to them. And so the ripples that these deaths have had is, you just really can't underplay how dramatic it is. Whether we'll continue on that or not, like I certainly hope not. I think all of these different avalanche groups you've been talking about and us are really trying hard to get these points across to people and encourage them to both continue to enjoy backcountry recreation, but to really think about what they're doing and have that long view, because you don't want to, make a mistake this year and lose out on the decades of great powder turns in the future. But it's really just going to depend on how things, play out over the next few months, whether this, turns into just a bad year or an unprecedented and terrible year.
Well, let's hope that this was just a really, really unfortunate, sad, horrible cluster, and that moving forward, we can really just have no more fatalities and really make good fundamental decisions moving forward. And I believe we averaged 26 or 27 avalanche fatalities in the U.S. a year. Which month sees the most avalanche deaths, at least in Colorado?
February and March.
February and March. So we're right in the thick of it, right? So it's February now, March is on its way. So, and the days are getting longer. I think all these things encourage us to be out there. So just another reminder to really keep it safe out there. All the advice we got here today, I'm just going to reiterate a couple things I can think of, and then I'd love to hear you jump in. But, what Ethan talked about today, go back to the fundamentals. Don't get complacent in terrain you're familiar with. Keep it under 30 degrees. Great advice. Any other thoughts here from you, Ethan, at the end of the show?
No, I think you summed it up well. But just to go back to, at least in Colorado, we're above the average number of deaths, and we're at the beginning of the two most deadliest months. And that's just a scary place to be.
Very scary. This is all, it's affecting me now, affecting my voice. I think this is also heavy and has affected us in so many ways. And I really appreciate your time today, Ethan. We're excited to get this message out to our listeners. And this is really scary and heavy. And I think we've come up with some good solutions for moving forward. So thank you so much. Have a great day. And let's make sure to stay in touch.
All right. Thanks, Miles. Thanks for getting the word out.
You bet. Thank you, Ethan. To learn more about avalanches and avalanche forecasts for the entire USA, please visit avalanche.org. To learn more about Colorado avalanches and see the Colorado forecasts, please visit colorado.state.gov. Thank you so much for listening to the Snowbrains podcast. If you liked this podcast, please share with your friends and family, and please subscribe. To find out more about Snowbrains, please visit us at snowbrains.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Snowbrains. This episode was edited by Robert Wilkinson. The music was done by Chad Crouch. I'm your host, producer, and creator, Miles Clark.